Welcome to the Police Free Campus podcast. I'm your host, Charles H.F. Davis III, and we are thankful to be joined in conversation today by comrades and colleagues working to reimagine post-secondary institutions in a world without police. First, I would like to welcome Dr. Leigh Patel, Professor of Educational Foundations, Organizations, and Policy at the University of Pittsburgh and author of No Study Without Struggle, Confronting Settler-Colonialism in Higher Education. Dr. Patel takes a transdisciplinary approach to understanding the role of narratives in creating material realities in school and society, to include how schooling delivers inequities and how education can be a tool for liberation. We're also joined by Dr. Davarian Baldwin, Pauley Rather Distinguished Professor of American Studies at Trinity College and author of In the Shadow of the Ivory Tower, How Universities Are Plundering Our Cities. Dr. Baldwin is a leading urbanist, historian, and cultural critic whose work examines the landscape of global cities through the lens of the African diasporic experience. Comrades, welcome.
Hey, thank you for having us. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm super excited for this conversation. In so much as I'm a huge fan of both of you all's work, it's certainly transformed the way that I think about what it is that we do in the field of higher education. And I think it's so important that we have this conversation, in part that much of what we understand about how college universities function has really been limited by like the frameworks from which we've pulled, right? And both of you have, I think, some really amazing insights that kind of bring us up to speed, both in terms of the historical foundations of how we understand what we've sort of broadly referred to as settler colonialism, as well as sort of in this contemporary iteration that is, this ongoing project, right? We often think of these things as historically bound as if they don't continue to exist. And so I want to kind of explore that with you all. And Sister Leigh, I want to start with your work kind of as a point of departure, and specifically this understanding of higher education itself as a settler colonial project. And so in your book, you talk about this idea that naming the problem of racism in higher education is necessary but insufficient. And so in doing that, you're kind of arguing that settler colonialism offers this more complete framework for understanding the relationships and distinctions between how marginalized, minoritized people experience various forms of what Jaleel Mustafa Bishop has called educational violence. And I wonder if you could like unpack that for us. About how sort of this idea that racism, especially in this moment where anti-racism is on everything, it's on this initiative and on that program, but you're sort of giving us this other thing that says, hey, this is probably a more helpful and complete understanding in conjunction with how we understand racism for what's going on in higher education.
Yeah, thank you for that. I appreciate that. In the book, I argue that we need settler colonial. Well, we don't need it, but we need it the tools that it has, how it operates as an ongoing structure, helps us. It gets that much closer to being able to name property as a problem, and then we can get into how universities are on stolen property, how so many universities were built by stolen labor from Black people, from Chinese people, many peoples. And I use that in conjunction with racial capitalism, because there's such a undeniable bottomless desire for wealth on the part of universities, even public universities that are scrambling and doing more and more they're trying to look like an elite school. They're trying to create that student experience that they can sell, and that helps to tie back to property as well. Settler colonialism also helps me a great deal, just particularly as more universities are starting to have land acknowledgement statement. And Teresa Amble Stewart and Wayne Yang have written a beautiful piece on going beyond land acknowledgements. But this might say I'm coming to you from the lands of the unceded territory, the lands of the Omiha peoples and Nipmuc peoples. Like, I can say that. And whether we acknowledge it or not, that also is a statement of invasion and settlement that tells somebody like, what happened here? Okay. And it's still happening here. So settler colonialism is really crucial for that as an ongoing structure, as more like climbing walls are built to sell that student experience. It helps us to understand land as property. It helps us to understand how Indigenous people are treated and not treated should they attempt to be part of higher education, that it's going to be governed by this thirst for property. And it will, if it does admit Indigenous students, Black students, brown students, there's that tax to pay that those students pay if they are phenotypically a minority. And that's one of the other reasons why it was important for me, to bring in settler colonialism is that racial capitalism is crucial, and race does not really work in defining indigenous peoples. They don't identify by a certain race. It's more about sovereignty to their tribe. So it's tribal affiliation than race. So that's a little bit of why I use that framework.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful, right? And you talk about that sort of, as you mentioned, this context of like land being made into property and sort of what that means, right? But also the property of persons, many of whom were foundational either through their direct labor or through like the sale, right, of enslaved persons that have often underwritten many of these institutions. And that property piece, I think, is so key. And so, we can think about that. And you reference Stewart and Yang and also Eve Tuck's work, who I know you're very familiar with. And it's so funny, like in our class, when we were talking about these land acknowledgements and students sort of saying, oh, this is like, a sort of positive movement of direction. And then we read about moves to innocence and like all the ways sort of the institution tries to absolve itself of these things without fully acknowledging or being honest, right, about like how it not only has it done certain things, but it continues to do those things. And Davarian, I want to bring you in here and thinking about your work, right? And so you introduce this idea of universe cities that speaks to sort of this ongoing accumulation by dispossession that post-secondary institutions generally, and then urban colleges and universities in particular have been undertaking. And what I would see is like an ever expanding endeavor of the higher education enterprise. And so I'm wondering, how do you think about your work kind of in that way of settler colonial projects, of accumulation, of property itself, but also this like forever expansion of property that really creates these boundaries, right, that are both real and fictitious, depending on where you're located, that have a huge number of implications for communities.
Yeah, I mean, the land question is really critical for the way I'm thinking about what I call universe cities, this growing influence and increased control that higher education takes over political governance and economic development in our cities. Now, I'm an urbanist by trade, and so I look at the city as this repository for managing and facilitating and coercing various realms of social relationships in a concentrated form. But of course, what I talk about can extend beyond simply the city. But as we move into what's being called the urban century, and a couple of years ago, where there are more people on the globe that live in quote unquote urban environments than rural ones, it has an impact that reaches beyond simply my own academic interests. But this land question is critical because it's the mechanism by which universities accumulate not just land, but also manage life and lifestyle. And that's really what's critical for me because, again, coming from urban studies, the question around planning, like what does it mean for a university to be the city manager of your labor, of your housing, of your policing, of your labor relationships, that it's in the role of a higher education institution within today's what I call the knowledge economy, which has become the dominant mechanism for producing and reproducing capital, that the university is no longer just a secondary player, but a primary one. And it's not just, many people talk up today about the corporatization of higher education, which suggests, and I think there's validity to that insight. I wouldn't take away from that. But I think it does us a little bit of a disservice because it almost exclusively suggests that the logic of corporate America or corporatism has been imposed on higher education. And we can see this in terms of, boards of trustees, the leadership coming from corporate America, the understanding of students as consumers, all these things make sense. But my, intervention or contribution to the conversation is that it's not just that the university has been corporatized, particularly through its management of land and labor, but it has found out ways to take advantage of its own status as a nonprofit entity to even do things that private companies can't do in today's political economy. So, for example, bringing it back to the land issue, the university can do things with land that corporations can't because it's a nonprofit, because it's a university. And so its status as a 501c3 in the tax code gives it tax-exempt status on its property. This creates a pathway whereby private investors they target universities to partner with them because university land as campus land triggers this financial arrangement that creates a tax shelter for both the university and its private partners. And so then at the same time, that accumulation of capital through this tax shelter not only produces wealth for the institution and its private partner, but it passes the burden on to host communities. because the money that the university doesn't pay in taxes would normally go to things like secondary schools, snow removal, trash removal, infrastructural maintenance, public services. So the wealth that we see in the gleaming glass and steel towers and university campuses that have building cranes all over the world today, that doesn't come just simply from their brilliance. It comes from taking wealth, land, and labor directly from the host communities where they sit. And this is the critical arrangement around the issues of land and labor that are so central to my thinking. And it helps understand why campus policing is so central to this conversation, because it becomes the front line in both extracting land, and it also becomes the front line in maintaining the wealth that is hoarded on that land. So I'll stop there. We can go forward.
Yeah, wow. So much there. And Leigh, you engage with sort of like this neoliberal turn as we've sort of framed it in the education space. But as Davarian was talking, I was thinking about even the extent to which these institutions are also parts of corporations, right? So we can think about the West Philadelphia Corporation and the role that the University of Pennsylvania played distinctly in just chairing and shepherding that, along with a number of other institutions like Drexel. There was, I think, a Presbyterian Medical College hospital at the time, right? And so we're getting now into this meds and eds space where they're actually also doing and have been doing for many, many decades, right, corporate style behaviors in service of this expansion of this ownership of property. And so, Leigh, in thinking about that in particular, and this idea of boundaries, right? And that's kind of, I think, how we're talking about institutions, this town and gown relationship we often refer to, or being referred to by the institution, how these demarcations, I guess both are real and fictitious, and then the consequences, right, of being able to acquire land and property that wasn't rightfully theirs to begin with, the disenfranchisement of communities who have been on that land, including indigenous communities, but also Black and Brown communities, in what has typically been like low income neighborhoods that are determined to be blighted, right, by this redevelopment plan. What does all of that mean in the way that we think about what a university actually does versus what it espouses it to do, right? It's sort of like this contribution to a public good, even though it's like deeply privatized. Oh, I think you're muted.
One of my favorite things to talk about. Thank you for that. So higher education has such a place in the public imaginary, and in material ways that people go about their lives. It even adds more, I think, for me, it adds much more depth when I engage with Davarian's materials, knowing that, as you said, like it creates a kind of life path or life blockage. It's active in people's lives, the university ownership of properties, and so many universities in these big eds and meds places. So what it's supposed to be doing, well, it's good to start with how it began. So I think it's good to remember that universities have always been exclusionary. They've never been inclusive. They didn't start out that way. They've never been that way. There's no way we can Marie Kondo ourselves out of it being exclusive, like having too many things. It has always been exclusive. And what it is supposed to do, I think, in that public imaginary, is play some kind of a role in the American dream, which is get a good job and get a better job because you have a college degree, be able to purchase a home, have a family, perhaps, on and on and on. And yet, when we look at how universities function, and in complete agreement with Davarian, no, it wasn't like, oh no, look at that rock that got landed on universities, and now they're having to figure out little ways, little stackable credentials that they can sell so they can make a living, or they can be viable as a corporation. That's not at all how that happened. It's very much an appreciation for Rod Ferguson's work on this. Yeah. It very much goes along with the times when corporate America started looking at a shift and using the appearance of diversity as a tactic to bring in more sales. So universities have been doing that, and have been doing other kinds of practices, other kinds of tactics to make itself seem like a place that's fun and that's welcoming and it's diverse. And so please come, while ramping up the tuition rates, because the two places where money goes at the highest rates on university campuses are administrator salaries and maintenance. And maintenance includes buildings. So it includes all. So while we're busy doing all of this, we are not teaching. And we're definitely not listening to what's happening in the world and being responsive to it, and also understanding that what is happening in the world is we're complicit in everything that happens in the world. So when we see, international comparative studies is a fantastically popular topic in higher education now, but less frequently is talked about the United States' role in Iran, in India, for example, with some of these places around the globe where totalitarianism is really having its day. Higher education is implicated in that because of the way it miseducates its population, busies them up with things that aren't factually accurate to maintain a rather docile society.
Wow. There's so much I want to get into with that, that we could be on the call for, I think, hours, right? And I think these are important interrogations. And I think that that's often it, right? Like you said, that this sort of conflation, and be it intentional, of the relationship between university through the idea of Americanism, I think generally, but also individualism, right? And all the ways that it individually is supposed to provide these things that we know, even just looking at the data for the folks who might be wary and saying, well, what does the data say? Well, we know that there are disproportionate returns, right? For folks who were not intended to be included in this experiment, the least of which, and one of the things on the front line right now, right, is the student debt conversation, and all the ways that is very much racialized debt, gendered debt, so forth and so on, that even coming out of this thing, we're actually worse off in some regards economically than we were going into it, that I think bears, a lot more conversation for us. I want to sort of turn here to what this means in the context of this idea of property, this idea of boundaries, and the insider-outsider dynamics that are created by institutions, which we've already sort of alluded to more generally, but then how that factors into the way that we think about policing, right? And I think for us, and the things that we're thinking about in the lab, is policing beyond the idea of police officers, right, or police departments, but sort of this set of practices that involve surveillance, control, domination, punishment, that through the avenues of campus police departments, right, have now been sort of given to institutions to further do what it is that they're doing, but also to support, and I think that we talk about with some other colleagues who will be on the podcast later, this sort of legitimacy to the carceral state, if not itself a part of the carceral state. So Davarian, I wonder if you can talk about, and again, your book, which is just like amazing. I mean, Leigh and I are huge fans. We spend a good part of our time together talking about your work. And how amazing it is. But you do these amazing case studies of cities, and you especially treat a lot of attention to Chicago. And one of the things we know, right, is University of Chicago has the largest privatized police force, definitely in the country. It might even be beyond that. But you talk about the relationship and how the University of Chicago's growth and development really gave rise to this deeply privatized police force. This has a terrible consequence for Black communities that are in proximity to the University of Chicago. So could you talk us a bit through that and sort of that boundary expansion, the role of policing in that process, and what that's meant for residents in Chicago?
Yeah, so thank you for that. Thank you both. I mean, I'm big fans of your work as well. So this is amazing. I guess Love Fest, which is great. But yeah, so the policing pieces, I got to be honest to you both and to people listening, is that policing came on my radar a little bit late. It was always there. But when I was talking about this rise of universities and the kind of new political economic system where universities at the center, I wasn't thinking centrally about policing. But then the summer of 2020 came, and it was amazing to the degree to which when people were talking about police abolition, there was this turn, and people were like, wait a minute, what are the biggest policers in my environment? They're not municipal police, not even county police. It's campus police. And that realization, I mean, that was in my thinking, but it in the post book, it's become even more central. And in thinking about Chicago, but also Hopkins, right? Hopkins is a test case right now because their police department was pushed forward and approved before the pandemic. But then the pandemic happened, and then the summer 2020 happened, and social movements forced them to halt that policing endeavor. But now they're going back full force. And so that's for those that don't know, keep aware of that. They just signed a memorandum of understanding with the city of Baltimore, and we all know that in a city where the police are already corrupt, that's going to be the primary pool where they're going to receive most of their campus police, which is just another layer of violence. But the Chicago case study you mentioned before, thank you, is like, is really powerful because they are the second largest private security force in the world outside of the Vatican. And it's important and instructive because when Hopkins was putting together the police force, Senator Mary Washington, who I spoke to at some length, thank you to her, she recognized that, in Maryland, public universities have police, but private universities had never done that before. So it's state by state, the level of the degree to which campus police have an impact, especially private university police. And because private universities are exempt from Freedom of Information Act laws, that exemption extends to their police forces. And so when this Hopkins police force was coming online, Mary Washington, to bring this whole story full circle about the Vatican, which Chicago and their great reach, she had likened Hopkins putting together a private police force as like putting a Vatican City in the middle of Baltimore. Now, what she meant by that is because it's a private police force that has arrest powers and jurisdiction beyond the main campus, certified by the state, but yet will have no public oversight. So basically, what police do in the very things talking about with land and capital accumulation is that the police force becomes a layer of governance that gives universities an unprecedented level of political autonomy. Because not only do they carry out their power in the ways in which they seize land and control labor, but then they have their own jurisdictional power in policing to have discretion about what they will identify as a crime and what they won't identify as a crime. And that's a piece that I think people don't, I think people on the ground understand that, but our listeners need to really, really, really understand that. And of course, shout out to Cops Off Campus as an organizing unit that highlights this. In Baltimore residents all over the country I've spoken to, they understand that policing becomes a function of what I call extraterritorial expansion. That when universities want to begin they're stretching their legs beyond the main campus, police are usually first because they dictate behavior. They dictate life chances in these neighborhoods. And then what I call kind of a velvet hammer approach to campus expansion. So, you send the police force in, and then the buildings and the outreach programs and the turkey giveaways come after. And so you have this dance and this coordination between hard and soft power, and policing serves a vital function in that. Again, not all universities police have jurisdiction beyond their main campus, but 9 in 10 do. About 85% have arrest powers and beyond their main campus, and most police forces are armed. So what does this mean from a political economic standpoint? It means that policing is this critical function, or serves as critical function in what Liddell Windling calls universities as a parastate, whereby they have this capacity to bring forth a settler-colonial vision, as Leigh would, I hope, would argue. I'm sure she would argue, but then have the capacity to not only push forward this vision, but then also to adjudicate, govern, and manage that framework with very little, which comes from public dollars, but very little public oversight, because we're haunted or we're enamored by what I call the myth of the schoolhouse, that what universities primarily do is just teach classes and conduct peer research. While, that what people in the hood say, throw a rock and hide your hand. This is what they're doing in material terms. And then we can, and I think we will, and we are starting to, but our intellectual or our conceptual frameworks have to be aligned to see not just what they say they are, but what they actually are. And policing becomes this most violent, visceral, in-your-face, explicit articulation of what they actually are in real time. So that's my thinking on policing.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to be said for this is an apparatus, right? And I think one of those key pieces that you mentioned is sort of its relationship to the state, right? So we know that, like, when you have sworn officers on campus, the state, right, are the folks who do the swearing in, right? And sort of this allegiance obligation. And we've seen in so many instances, we can think about what happened at the University of Minnesota several years ago, both in terms of the call for the discontinuance of the relationship between the university and municipal police, but then also the dispatch of university police to Brooklyn Center, right? Sort of in the aftermath of what had happened there. And that we see this also, again, in Philadelphia. Walter Wallace Jr. is killed north of campus, right? And who is dispatched to the scene? It's going to be the University of Pennsylvania Police Department. Same thing on 52nd Street when the insurrection was happening there. And so this ever expanding ability to be leveraged by the state as it so chooses, in so much as it provided you its power, and yet there's no level of public accountability. We could almost liken this to say like the charter school discourse, right? And that it's like, you know, public resources and then privatized sort of levels of accountability, if at all, to folks who again aren't necessarily members of the community, and that the university doesn't see itself as a member of the community. It sees itself as distinctive, right? As something other than where it actually is located. And so, Leigh, I'm wondering, in response to some of the things that Davarian shared, how does this match up with sort of the way that settler colonialism has used militarism or used policing in and of itself as, I guess it's muscle, for lack of a better word, right? And where do you kind of situate that? And we, as I was thinking about policing as sort of this settler colonial technology of sorts.
Yeah, it absolutely is a technology that's used in that structure of settler colonialism. It's used to protect the property at all costs, and so it falls into the same patterns and practices that we see law enforcement generally using. And I want to bring on in also here that aren't exclusively done by police members, by a long shot are not done by police cops. So I joke, like, we could take all the cops off campuses, there would still be a lot of policing going on. So the presence of police officers is a material signifier that the police are there, and what their job is to do. I think overall, or what they might say their job is to do is, well, they might even go so far as to say their job is to protect the community, but that's an outright lie. Their job is to make sure that only the people who are supposed to be on the campus are on the campus. And so it's good to go. I think it's helpful here to go to Ronald Reagan in the 1980s and how much hatred he had for the Black Panther Party. And there's a tight timeline, a very close timeline, when some of the Black Panther Party gatherings would take place on some university campuses, and there were some students involved in the party as it was being organized, and it was taking.
Well, the very founding, right? It's like it's at Merritt College by
Merritt College. Yep.
College kids for all intents and purposes.
Yeah. And that's when tuition started at the University of California. And that was a tactic, I believe. It did lots of things. It allowed to charge for money. And it also allowed for this policing of who gets to be on this campus and who cannot be on this campus. So it does several things. But with the extra legal, to bring in some of Ruth Wilson Gilmore's wording here. So there's the legal and extra legal acceleration to illness and death, which is how Ruth Wilson Gilmore defines racism among different populations. It was a few years back, this mother called on a campus visit because she was concerned there were two youth who had arrived late to the tour, and they just looked suspicious to her. And so here we go, cops on the scene, and they happen to be two Native youth. And it's too much like just on the nose that I hesitated to even use it in the book, because it's like, nah, I'm just making this up. This can't. But it's very much on the nose. So all the things that we know about how policing it enforces white supremacy, it enforces heteropatriarchy, it enforces ableism. It does all of these things. Ableism is one of the primary ways in which harm done by police officers, the person who has been harmed, that comes back to be their fault because of a condition that they had. So there's many ways that policing in structured settler colonialism is there to protect the property and is there to help grow the property. And it's a symbolic thing of that, but I think it's important to remember how much policing goes on that does not involve police at all. So
Mhm.
there's this carceral mindset that should be in the conversation, the carceral mindset of professors. And me being in a school of education, it's a feat to help beginning teachers to not police,
Mhm.
like
Mhm.
to allow children to do some things, to understand small things like that when children are rocking back and forth or tapping like that, that's a thing that serves the central nervous system. Don't give them detention or throw them at a psychologist to get a label, but we do that. So that's throughout the entire project. And one other thing I would say about that that goes along with property and how race does enter settler colonialism, one of the ways it enters, it is almost always to protect a white woman, almost always
Mm.
to protect a
Mhm.
white woman. So the mother on the tour guide, a mother concerned about the safety of her children on a campus. The safety of white women is so sacrosanct in
Mhm.
so much of the political economy of the United States, including
Hmm.
Southern colonialism. Yeah, yeah.
I just want to jump in real quick to to co-sign what Leigh is saying right here, because in every conversation I've had about police abolition, the immediate response almost every time, like clockwork, was, what if someone, and by someone we know white women, what if someone gets raped? That was almost always the direct response. And I would add that policing is not just is about protecting the land, and by extension, it's a question of brand management.
Hmm.
Uh, and what I mean by that is, if we look at what's the actual, if we take policing seriously, which I don't, but if we take policing seriously, when it comes to what is their actual function, and the claims that campus police make when they extend their jurisdiction beyond the main campus, the claim is community safety, which includes the main campus of students and affiliates and the extended campus beyond the main boundaries. So we take that seriously, but we look at what has been the primary responsibility of campus police on the campus. It has been to police crimes on campus. What are the major crimes on campus? Sexual assault and substance abuse and petty theft. Campus police do a horrible job of policing. So again, if we take this seriously, campus policing does a horrible job of policing those quote unquote crimes.
Right.
Some would say, well, we need more police. It's a matter of capacity. But when we look at the record, it is clearly a matter of intent, because they under police crime on campus, because what university wants to acknowledge that they have a campus full of white criminals? None, because it will undermine the brand. So where do they police? They over police in the surrounding neighborhoods, because it signals to families, students, and their investors, which I mentioned earlier. It signals to all those people that the area is safe for investment. And so what appears to be incongruous is actually consistent. The under policing on campus and the over policing in the surrounding neighborhoods come together through an understanding of policing as brand management. And so I just want people to really be clear about that. And this brings us to a solution question about, well, when we think about what are the actual needs of police of safety, for community safety, what are they in communities? Housing security, food security, trauma care, just to start off. What institution could do these things very, very well? A university and their affiliate medical centers. And yet they do none of this. We have, and I'm working with the Beyond Flexner Alliance, which is an organization of university medical professionals, to ensure or to insist that, because medical institutions that are affiliated with universities receive another tax exempt status predicated on their meeting the social mission, which none of them actually meet, because they are allowed to self-report. So institutes of higher education have the greatest capacity to actually serve, or one of the greatest capacities to serve community safety, and they do none of this. And yet they are allowed to have tax exemptions and other payments, etc., based on their own self-reported claims of what they do in the communities. And yet you can have a globally ranked institution like Hopkins Medical or Yale New Haven Health sit in the middle of communities that are enduring supreme, extreme health disparities, and yet they're highly ranked.
Yeah.
How can this be? And so what we're doing with this coalition, this think tank, and we're actually becoming a lobbying group going to Congress next in the spring, is saying that the rankings of these hospitals and these medical facilities must be aligned with the way in which they meet their social mission, and they can't self-report anymore. So I know I'm kind of going beyond the policing conversation, but I guess my point here is that we're talking, if we extend policing to safety or security, institutions of higher education have the capacity to do interesting things. And this really raises a question around, and Leigh, we had this conversation at the American Studies Conference a couple of weeks ago about this question around abolition. Does abolition mean destroy the university? Does it mean transform it? Does it mean free it from its current conditions? This is a live discussion, and it's clearly tied to the question around police and police abolition. So maybe we can talk about that in a minute. But I just wanted to put that out there, that what Leigh was talking about around white women, around what if someone gets raped, it's not just a question. It becomes a way to make police abolition unthinkable, to conceptualize different versions of safety and security beyond a carceral approach. White women serve that foil. And the university is critical in upholding this technology, this dynamic, to go forth business as usual. Right. So I just wanted to add that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you're drawing together, I think, an important part. And we talked about this with some of the Cops Off Campus folks in one of our other episodes, but this idea that, to your point, right, we could almost also have security and like not have safety in some regards, right? We could think about the university as a place that's very secure in terms of the way that patrolling is happening, the desire to keep out certain folks, and yet it's not safe on the campus, as evidenced by the things that we know that are happening, right? And the presence of police hasn't stopped the, just, I don't even know like how to categorize the catastrophe of campus sexual violence and all the things that we know that perpetuate it that we're also doing nothing about. But then also then the community isn't just not being held as a place of service, right? But like we're exacerbating and making worse the conditions in which people are expected to live, work, and learn. So much of that, to the point about this idea of policing, I was so thankful, Leigh, that you brought up sort of the way that white femininity plays deeply into the policing in this country. It always has, right? We think about the Klan, we can think about, slave patrol, so forth and so on, all in sort of the name of protecting white femininity. That was all the while being exploited by, white patriarchy simultaneously. But in thinking about the policing that we have for ourselves, right, this sort of like cops in our heads and hearts, as Rojas writes about and talks about. But then when we think about the profession, right, we think about like we are anomalous in many regards with the fact that we're even college faculty, that we're able to sort of navigate this terrain to a point to be able to have careers in this space that is still predominated by white folks. And if we look at teaching, right, we know that profession is also predominated by white women. And so when we look at school discipline, right, or even like disciplining and the idea of the university, are who the folks that are calling the cops actually, and then also sort of self-deputized as police. And we've seen so many stories recently of like, a student said something that was disagreeable in class. And so the faculty member calls the police to like have them removed, even though this is supposed to be a space for the debate of ideas, right? So the conservative folks would say. And so I think a lot about that too, of like, in what ways are we implicated, if not directly participatory or expected to, right? Even in our contracts and the ways we talk about what resources are available to do this work. And then how, sort of in your estimation, is that a thing that we can resist and push back on in the ways that we think about what it means to be safe and secure, even as, that things are happening on campus? How do you interpret that, given your role as a faculty member and having, sort of seen the place inside and out for many years, of what police would not afford us, and then sort of the role of trying to ensure that folks feel safe, in the environments in which you occupy?
Well, there's a lot of different ways. I think, the first question that you offered to me, Charles, I'm thinking back on that. I'm like, oh, I should have said that it forgets about, it's supposed to be about learning. And I love learning. I absolutely love it. So what this does, this presence of police, the carceral mindset, what that does within university spaces is really exactly what you said, is really maintain and be complicit with, but actively maintain a culture in which sexual violence and gender-based violence is the norm. This is the norm. And as Davarian was saying, because there's no way universities now as corporations are going to admit to sexual violence happening at the rate that it happens on university. They're not going to admit that. So the police are there in many ways to dampen that down, to do things in the reports that lower, if they do a report, that's a big if there already, if they're called it, if they do a report, that they get to narrate it in such a way that reduces the university's role and responsibility in addressing bodily safety. You know, I think back to not back to the pandemic. I think to the pandemic that we are still in. And I think about it in 2020 and the uprisings in 2020. And one of the reasons why schools reopened in the fall of 2020, not anywhere near a level of safety that not anywhere near it, but what it did that so that people could not keep talking to each other, because for just a blip, for a rare moment, people had the time to connect A to dot B. They were able to connect those things and rose up worldwide. And the universities and K through 12 schools opened up right away. I've always argued this, that they opened up as an act of property violence, in order to, like, we can't have that uprising again, because if people keep connecting dots, they're going to say, like, what if you took all the resources that you had and you made them available to everybody? What if Pittsburgh, the city where I'm employed, what if Pittsburgh didn't have such high rates of mortality for Black infants, for Black women, for trans women, for Black men, just Black people across the board? And that's 24% of the population of Pittsburgh. So where is this eds and meds responsibility related to that statistic and that reality? It's much more than reality. So grateful for the work that Davarian is doing, and that other people in Pittsburgh are also organizing around that, because it's just so glaringly obvious. I feel like I'm adrift from your question though, Charles.
That's okay. All of this is really brilliant and I think really helpful and instructive. Right. Because again, I think in the broader context, we need to expand this idea of like what policing is, but also how policing is made possible. Right. And I think a lot about the various conditions that are brought upon and as a result of what colleges and universities do, that is often not just perceive that they do, but they talk about what it is that they're doing, right? And a lot of that is through this sort of like branding exercise, this PR, this way of like refashioning and understanding that we are supposed to just trust, because this is where, right, as we understand the knowledge economy, this is where knowledge is produced, not where knowledge is consumed, which we could actually interrogate in a really important way too. So we're just supposed to trust that if the university says this is what happened, then that's what happened, because these are people who know things, right?
Yeah. Can I offer an example of what we're talking about, and then we'll go where you want to go. So I was an associate dean for a while, for 2 years, and that was interesting. And one of the things that was interesting about it is that I got to be, because I was on every possible committee, it felt like. So I was on the committee that attended to students' basic needs. Okay, yeah, this sounds like a committee I'll show up for. This is good. And they had just formed not too long ago. There were university representatives on it, students as well. And they had formulated their first statement of like, this is what students' basic needs are. And it included having housing security. And this was, I think, right at that time that I was just speaking of, when campuses were reopening, which is also important for me to note that the people who had to do the cleaning and entering of the buildings and be most exposed to the people who likely had the most access to healthcare if they needed it, that is where these missions and these projects of property accumulation and serving the public is just another example of where they absolutely are in direct conflict. So at this basic student needs means they had down this sentence of having access to having secure housing. And I suggested that we add in there, particularly because it was during what was a lockdown period and there were still so many cases, but even regardless of that, I would have made the same suggestion, which is, could we put housing free from abuse? And there was an associate vice provost in the meeting, lovely person. I'm sure they don't kick their dog when they get home, all of these things. Certainly we can't put that down in there. Why can't we write that? well, the university can't guarantee that. I'm like, the world can't guarantee that, but that doesn't mean we don't put it in there.
Mm.
And so coming back to talking about abolition, if we don't have the courage to say what would be a way for resources and knowledge and for people to be connected so that they thrived, so they did well in life. In doing well doesn't mean like you get that car. It just means you thrive as a human being. If universities close off all of their resources, yes, definitely out of fear of what that might do to the brand, but also because we are such a litigious society that universities are very shy about saying anything that they may be held responsible for. And ironically, they are responsible for all of these things.
Mm.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you for that. I know we're coming to the end of our time here, and I think one thing that's important that I think is helpful generally is to really directly engage sort of our own visions or understandings of abolition, what that might mean. And so, of course, we're drawing heavily on Ruthie Gilmore's sort of articulation, right, that abolition is not about absence, it's about presence of life-affirming institutions.
Right.
And I think the impetus for what we were thinking about here was what would it mean to reimagine higher education as a life-affirming institution, right? As sort of a starting point. And then I've sort of, as I've continued to go through this process of study and struggle, realizing that in many ways that might be an incomplete assessment, but I think nonetheless a good starting point. And so I'm wondering, Davarian, if we can start with you, what does that mean in your own mind of like the idea of abolition, higher education, and that being more of a life-affirming thing than what we've seen, what we've discussed over the term of our conversation today?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you. So, I love the work of Moten and Harvey, and talking about, commons and commenting, which is had a long tradition. But before they came out with that very poignant approach to higher education, the notion of stealing, there are people like Henry Louis Taylor, yes, the father of Keonta Taylor, who was a activist and planner, Black Marxist planner, who at Buffalo was asked in the 80s to reimagine their urban campus. And he talked about the campus as a commons back then. And what that meant was making the university basically, in, for lack of a better phrase, the living room of the community, open access, mixed housing between residents and students, common areas fully available, cafeterias available. Basically, something that I saw throughout my work on this book and beyond is that, community residents, not for a lack of a vision, but for an understanding of what higher education can be, have always said to me, we don't want to burn up the cafeterias and the classrooms and the labs. We want all of that, but we want it for us. And that's what I think about when I think about abolition. We can abolish the relations of production that take place within the framework of higher education, but we don't want to abolish education. And that's critical. Education is not designed with the carceral logic. It's been appropriated, it's been colonized by our carceral logic, but I'm not yet willing to give up on education as a liberatory project. And I might be seen as, pejoratively discounted as a reformist, heaven forbid. But that's what I believe in. And I think history will absolve me. When I look at things like, the brothers and sisters at Crane Junior College who took it over in '69 and renamed it Malcolm X Community College and started teaching, not just for the DEI folks. They didn't just teach Black courses and argue for Black faculty members, but they started a prison annex for incarcerated residents. And they fired the off-duty Chicago police officers and hired a Black-owned security team, unarmed. This reimagining is what I think about, which includes safety. It includes classes. It includes diversity, but it understands these things in a materialist context, that if the university, and they saw this already in 68, 69, also the sisters and brothers at CUNY, if the university is going to be this facilitator of capital and life chances, far beyond some quaint notion of the Ivy Tower, then we need to control that institution. We need to seize control of the institution and facilitate the levers of its manifestations in ways that benefit our liberation. That's what I mean by abolition. So that's what when I talk today about pilots, payments in lieu of taxes, and community-based zoning and planning boards. And I talked with this this brother at Pennsylvania. I just mentioned in the passing about, cafeterias are low-hanging fruit. Why couldn't we take the cafeterias that throw away tons of food every night and repackage it into healthy meals for communities in need? this medical student at the Perelman School, Perelman School at Penn, of all places, said, you know what, that's a great idea. He started doing that with the DSA, the local DSA, Democratic Socialists. And now they are taking the food every Friday and packaging it in healthy meals from Penn's medical school cafeteria for communities in need. So these are the things that I mean, because these infrastructures, these resources, these capacities, they're within the frame. They're not within the framework, but they're within the holdings of higher education, but they need to be liberated. And so that's what I mean by abolition. I'm not willing to give up on education. Education must be defended. Another framework, another university is possible. I believe that. Or I wouldn't be. We're all at universities. How dare us sit here, with self-righteousness and not think about how do we want to transform ourselves versus saying it should be all burned down, yet we still collect a paycheck. That's just, to me, it's unconscionable to make that claim. How dare us? But also from a materialist framework, we look at Marx and we look at the abolition of labor relations. They weren't saying burn down the factories. They were saying the factories need to be under the control of the people. I have the same logic when it comes to universities. So I stand firm on that. So Leigh, go ahead, please.
Yeah, very similar to you, Davarian. It's very much an opening up that I think that university, they should just open up. Things should not be behind paywalls. It is, I think, one thing that you mentioned to just like open that up a little bit bigger, because you mentioned many different, necessarily we would need many different components to be working together in different ways, in ways that benefited the public. And just knowing that knowledge is not behind paywalls, because you have to and the purpose of an education isn't that you wave a certificate around. No, education and knowledge is everywhere. It just becomes captured and monetized in a university. So the abolition of that is you take away the borders around that knowledge. You destroy those borders. You make it a place where people can come if they are sick. People can just come if they want to come. So like the mixed residency, that is a really beautiful and deeply radical thought, because universities, to my knowledge, have never, ever did a thing like, we'll communities, people have needs of housing. Maybe they could have some of the housing on universities. No, because we got to charge like this amount of money for this, and we got quads and the bathrooms. But it's so incredibly easy to do, and that's our step. That's our work. And I agree with Davarian. Like, why keep harping about it if we don't have an idea of what learning is, and how to have that, what learning and what life is, and have that be at the center always.
All right, well, I know it's time to wrap up here. I just want to thank you all again, Brother Davarian and Sister Leigh. Thank you so much for all of what you've contributed, and we look forward to continuing this conversation.
Thanks so much, Brother Charles. Appreciate you. Thank you, Leigh.
Thank you.
All right, take care. Thank you for tuning in to the Police Free Campus podcast. I'd also like to thank the National Center for Institutional Diversity and the Anti-Racism Collaborative's Research Community Impact Fellowship, whose generous support made today's production possible. For more information about the Police Free Campus project, or to find resources about reimagining a world without police, visit our project website at policefreecampus.org. If you're interested to learn more about the work at the Campus Abolition Research Lab, consider joining our mailing list by visiting our website at campusabolition.org or following us on Twitter at campusabolition. We really appreciate y'all rocking with us, and we hope to continue to produce content that helps make new worlds possible. So be sure to tell your friends about us, and don't forget to share, like, and comment wherever you're listening to our podcast. Until next time, study, struggle, and peace.